After Brazil and the U.S., India is the third worst hit country when it comes to COVID-19. The government in Delhi has started easing restrictions after a 3-month lockdown, but the result is that new cases and deaths are rising at their fastest pace since the pandemic began.
After 3 months of lockdown, life in New Delhi is almost back to normal. Millions of Indians have lost their jobs in the corona crisis. Now, the economy is sputtering back to life. But with restaurants and shops open again, the coronavirus is also making a comeback. We're afraid. We have to leave our house to make a living, but we fear for our lives. Many hospitals have reached capacity, and the country is scrambling to increase its intensive care units. This wedding hall has been filled with hospital beds. 12 doctors staff the emergency treatment centre. We have around 100 beds here. We have patients with mild and less severe symptoms, and even some without symptoms that have nowhere else to quarantine. India has ramped up its testing. Authorities fear that the tests will reveal a rising number of infections.
Demonstrators have stormed the Serbian parliament in the capital, Belgrade, to protest a renewed lockdown. President Aleksandar Vučić imposed a curfew and banned gatherings of more than 5 people after a surge in coronavirus deaths. 13 people died of COVID-19 on Tuesday, Serbia's highest single-day death toll. Residents of Melbourne in Australia are getting ready to return to lockdown for 6 weeks due to the new spike in coronavirus infections there. Police have also been deployed along the Victoria state border to enforce quarantine measures. The state has seen a spike in COVID-19 cases in recent days. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison promised his government would provide financial aid to local businesses, which are worried they won't survive another lockdown. For more now, we're joined by Melanie Burton. She's a journalist working for Reuters in Melbourne, Australia. Melanie, a city of 5 million being forced back into lockdown mode. How do people feel about that?
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I think everyone's feeling a bit flat. We just started having some of our restrictions being eased. Pubs had just started to open up, so that was exciting. It's school holidays now, but yeah, now we're all back in our houses and not going anywhere. That's within metropolitan Melbourne anyway.
The border between the states of Victoria and New South Wales, those are Australia's 2 most populous states. That border is now closed. What impact is that going to have on Australia and its economy?
Yeah, so the border between the 2 states, it's a river, and so there's a number of towns that straddle each side of the border. So for people, it's pretty common for people to live on one side and work on another side. This morning, you had police checking everybody who was coming over the bridges, and there were queues for more than an hour just to get home or to get to your place of work. Most of those areas are fairly regional and fairly rural, so the disruption itself will be pretty localized. What it means, I think, for people who have been planning holidays after the first lockdown, maybe their kids wanted to go and visit their cousins in another state. Well, I guess that's not going to be happening now.
Okay. Can you tell us why Australia is suffering the spike in coronavirus infections now?
Yeah, sure. So unfortunately, it's just the state that I'm in, Victoria, where we've seen a big jump in new infections, more than we saw the first time around. We had record infections this week, about nearly 200 on a single day. So New South Wales, Western Australia, most of the country is still okay, and coronavirus restrictions are easing. So it's just this one state. Authorities believe it's to do with some returning travellers who were in quarantine hotels and the security guards at quarantine hotels not following strict protocols in regards to sanitation.
Mm-hmm. Melanie, thank you very much for talking with us. That was journalist Melanie Burton in Melbourne, Australia. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has tested positive for the coronavirus. Bolsonaro has downplayed the severity of the disease for months, describing it as a little flu. Critics said it was only a matter of time before he caught the disease himself, as he has failed to socially distance and has largely refused to wear a mask in public.
From the very beginning of the outbreak, Jair Bolsonaro repeatedly played down the risks of the coronavirus and initially described it as a little flu. He also flouted social distancing recommendations and other measures, including wearing face masks in public. Bolsonaro had been tested 3 times previously. All came back negative. However, on Tuesday, the Brazilian right-wing leader confirmed to local media he had tested positive for COVID-19. It started on Sunday with a certain feeling of being unwell that got worse on Monday, with nausea, tiredness, a bit of muscle pain, and a fever that reached 38 degrees in the late afternoon. I then thought that with these symptoms, and with the presidential doctor believing it to be a possible COVID-19 infection, I had a CT scan at a military hospital here in Brasilia. My lungs were clear. Brazil is the second worst hit country in the world after the US, with more than 65,000 deaths and at least 1.6 million coronavirus cases. Despite this, bars, restaurants and other businesses are slowly reopening, but people still have doubts. As long as we follow the safety measures with space between the tables, I think it's worth reopening. We are the only ones in here, but if, for instance, there's someone on another table, I think I would probably feel uncomfortable. The WHO has warned the pandemic is far from over, as it's taking its toll around the world.
There have now been 11.4 million cases of COVID-19 and more than 535,000 lives have been lost. The outbreak is accelerating, and we have clearly not reached the peak of the pandemic.
The World Health Organization also wished Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro a speedy recovery in his own battle against the coronavirus.
Earlier, we asked Matthias Ebert if it looked like Bolsonaro would change his views on the views of Bolsonaro, of course, on COVID-19 now that he has the disease.
I think he might not change his views and his opinion on the crisis, because his motto is business first, economy first, in order to be re-elected in 2 years. So I think he will stay the same president as before, and all the signs that we see so far are going into the same direction.